Good to have you on, Dan.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Yeah, thanks for the invite. I always enjoy, I'm flattered when people say, "Hey, could you come on the podcast?" So I appreciate it.
Well, we're always looking for the experts out there, and you're one of them. So tell us a little bit about yourself. We'll jump into things.
Yeah, so again, David Schultz. I'm the owner of G5 Consulting. I've been in manufacturing, process control, and automation for going on 30 years now. Some people have a hard time believing that. I just tell them I started when I was 12. Most of the work I do is around, of course, systems integrator, but it's a lot more of the consulting. So if you're familiar with these maturity assessments and readiness, I'll do quite a few of those. We do a lot around the ISA 95 standard for how do we apply that for a lot of our digital transformation efforts. And of course, everybody is doing a unified namespace or a UNS. That's another one. So consulting around those types of things. And of course, this education around change management, event storming, those types of things. So, even though we like to be more on the consulting side first, in the education side, there are projects that need to be executed. So those will get executed as well as an additional systems integrator. But I'd say just in geography, being in the upper Midwest of the United States, it's a lot of food and beverage, a lot of CPG, but certainly there's a lot of other industries, lots of experience in.
So you and I used to be on the ISA, so the International Society of Automation, their SMIoT, part of the IoT division, before they sunsetted all that.
Okay.
And you brought up industry readiness surveys. I do have to ask, because I was on that subcommittee there, which ones did you follow? Was it the Siri one, or was it just sort of a one that you had sort of built custom?
Yeah, so there's a company called 4.0 Solutions, and they have their DTMA, Digital Transformation Maturity Assessments, and that's the one that I am more of a practitioner of. But like everything, I'll always relate it back to my favorite acts. I've changed the handle 3 times and the head twice. It's still my favorite. Same thing applies within a DTMA. There are things that I bring from the experience that I have, and more of the formal process from that DTMA. But like most of the practitioners of any one of those, they always make it their own. They bring with them what works, and then certainly leave the rest. So that's the one that's there.
And DTMA just digital transformation and maturity assessment, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. And it can be generic in this case. It does refer to a specific one, but I believe the Ohio Manufacturers Association, they have a DTMA, and I think several of these are manufacturing extensions that exist in the states or throughout the states. I think they all have a DTMA in some flavor or form.
So this is something interesting, though we wanted to get into, talking a little bit of standards, infrastructure, architecture, and that. Anytime we talk standards, we're always talking about typically government bodies, at least international organizations. The I4.0 stuff. I mean, that's its own company, right? I mean, we're talking a private organization. Even Siri, started out Singapore Industry Readiness Index. It's Inset now, which is a private company. But you also talk about Ohio bringing a few things out. Do we see this kind of this sort of push, or some of the movements that are being made here in Industry 4 with standards, with maturity assessments? Do you think it's going to be government, or is it going to be the private entities that are pushing this forward?
Yeah, I think you're always going to have a little bit of both. Certainly, governments, even within the state of Wisconsin, there's a manufacturing extension, and they have their ability to come out and do assessments and those types of things. And you're going to see private industry doing them as well, because every company that I work with that, whether it's on the sales side or on the consulting side, they always have their own flavor of how do we go in and assess what's there. It's always what's the current state, what's a potential future state, and then how do we get there, and what does that look like? In terms of having a standard practice, I always talk about the right technology. So some will say, let's use the best in class of, whatever it is, the functionality that we're looking for. I'm always the right technology. What's the technology that can be consumed, that people can adopt, that people can support? Because, I'll laugh at myself and say, man, we're just brilliant. We came up with this great solution, and we're just marveling at our brilliance of how good and robust it is. And 6 months later, the client isn't using it. And, that's a fail. And it's because we didn't use the right technology. We didn't capture the nuance of what was there. It's, we brought in a lot of rocket science, and sometimes duct tape baling wire works great. That is the right technology. So I'll say that on the, in terms of doing these maturity assessments as well, is If you look at I think RAMI is one of them. I mean, that is extensive. And I would say something similar around Siri as well. I like the DTMA because it's right sized in the sense that the practitioners of it, generally speaking, have worked in manufacturing. So it's by manufacturers for manufacturers. And it's right sized in the sense that it really focuses around what's happening operationally speaking in all the various groups that go around to affect what can we do to improve what it is that we're doing around gaining access to real-time data so we can do real-time decision making. So I don't know if there's a need for a standard per se around the assessments, but I think you'll always find, a little bit of everybody bringing their own flavor.
Yeah. No.
I think as long as that works, that's really the goal.
Well, it works. And I want to ask you as well, I think, standards can be used sometimes as a bit of a backstop. I think you find some people, in my experience, has been sort of two groups. The ones that are kind of pushing forward and, hey, let's try this new technology. And the others that are like, hey, I want to see I want to make sure that I'm following the standards. So if anything goes wrong, I can hold this piece of paper up and be like, hey, I did it to the standards. But you kind of see that right now. Are we still finding those two groups? Do we find that one's making progress and the other one isn't?
So within standards, it's sometimes that can be used as it's a bludgeoning stone of it's the standard, and it's like the Mandalorian, this is the way type of thing. And then there's those standards, they don't work, they're too hard, they're cumbersome, sorry, straw man alert, but there's all kinds of criticisms of standards. And I think it's important to understand what's the spirit of the standard, what are we trying to do with the standard? And almost going back to what we were just talking about on those maturity readiness is take what works and leave the rest. And, they're designed to be, yes, they're verbose, but that's by design so they can apply for a lot of different things. But there's nothing in there that says you have to use the extent of it or the full breadth of whatever that standard might look like. It's whatever it is we're trying to do, use what works and leave the rest. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you guys, you're a manufacturer, people, companies need to manufacture things. Get product out the door and do it in a way. That said, on the flip side, what standards do and what I like to say is standards exist so that things fit. So if you want to do some sort of, if you always want to scale and extend the solutions that you're deploying out there, because it's easy to solve a problem, but can you scale and extend it? That's where standards really come in to help. They thought through a lot of the things that you might run across so that, if nothing else, it's a point of conversation of what it is we're trying to do. But I'm a big standard. We've probably talked before since you mentioned ISA. ISA 95 is one that's near and dear to my heart. I also like the PAC ML standard, and that way we can align on what's the state of the equipment, that type of thing. And it's really just trying to provide a common language. So, in terms of some of the specific ones, those are certainly two that I use.
So maybe expand on both of those. I'm familiar with ISA 95, the Purdue model and that. PAC ML, not so much. Maybe expand a little bit on what those do and where you kind of see them being used.
Yeah. So just for clarification, the ISA 95, it's an interface, and what it's trying to capture is how do we exchange data between level 4 and level 3 systems. That's what ISA 95 does. And it starts with the building blocks of the 4 resource models. So you'll have equipment, personnel, assets, and materials. And then we get into the information objects, which we help either define a process, we schedule demand of a process, or we're measuring the results of the process. So, there's a progression of what that standard looks like, but it's now how are we going to exchange information? How do these information models fit together? And how do we build them up so that we can start doing the exchange of information? Based on that standard, there are a couple of schemas that can be used that Mace put together. One of them is B2MML. The other is BatchML. BatchML it takes advantage of that integration between ISA 95 and ISA 88. Another standard for how we do batch control within a process, and it provides some nice standards for how we're going to exchange that information. So ISA 95, it's the standard around how do we integrate level 4 to level 3. So PACML is around the state of equipment, and it's designed of, am I in execute? Am I held? Am I starting? Am I stopping? Do I need to be reset? So all it's doing is taking advantage of different commands of what is the equipment supposed to be doing versus what is the equipment doing. And then through that, if you call it a truth table, you'll derive what the actual state is. It just becomes a common way to express what's happening on this equipment right now. And then as you historize that information, you know exactly what what was the state? What was it doing? Was it transitioning, or was it an actual execution state? That type of thing. But sometimes you'll have it's running, it's starved, it's unplanned downtime, planned downtime. Well, let's put a little more details around that, at least from a generic standpoint, so we can all agree on what the thing is.
Yeah, and that can be difficult, especially when we're dealing with large organizations, mergers and acquisitions. We see that for sure.
And that's that's just part of the genericity of them, if that's even a word. Is that the more you can abstract it, the more you're going to future-proof whatever it is that you're doing. And yes, it takes time to understand how to fully implement it, but once it's done, it's like riding a bicycle, learning a language. Once it's there, then all of a sudden it just becomes second nature, and everybody just they kind of get it.
Yeah, it takes a bit, but it's worth it in the end.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to the functional side, so like the ISA 9588, there's been a lot of discussion lately about is ISA 95 dead or on its way out? And we're seeing new models like UNS and the data. Yeah, I think you're still kind of some experience on this one.
Yeah, there's a lot of ink that's been spilled over. Nope, it still absolutely applies, and that's the camp that I am in. I will always push back, and it's I don't think you truly understand what the ISA 95 standard is, because if you did, you'd realize that nope, it absolutely still applies for it. I think there's some misunderstanding around what that is. So when you start talking modern architectures, these are some fun facts about the standard. When I say, so is MQTT referenced anywhere in the standard? And the typical answer is no. And I show them actually it's referenced several times in there. MQTT is an absolute valid way to do it. Same thing with pub sub. You get into part 5 of the standard. That's where you'll actually talk about, is this a push? Is this a pull? Or is this just a pub sub? What is it that I'm doing? All that information is there. Remember, ISA 95 is functional. It's about how do we exchange information between two systems. It's really silent on how things are networked or how things are connected. You mentioned Purdue model. When you really look at the traditional Purdue, it was around the 4 R's. So it was going to be your response time and your repairability. And I'm always can never remember all of them, but it was really just how do we want to segment to make sure that I don't have voice over IP data flowing on the same network infrastructure as, say, my control network is. So we're going to segment these things off so that they are different. ISA 95 references that Purdue in terms of the levels of what type of information are we going to see on whether it's they call it the office LAN, or whether it's my industrial LAN or my control LAN. What's the type of information? What's the resolution? There's another one of the R words there. What I'm going to expect. So I think sometimes we conflate things together in terms of ISA 95 just says these are the levels. This is level 3. This is your manufacturing operations management domain versus, say, level 4, and that's the enterprise. Those can be things like your ERP and the like. But there's nothing that says, and this is how thou shalt connect them this way. Even in the original Purdue, nothing ever said that you can't go from, I believe there were 7 levels in that you can't skip. You have to only do adjacent communication. You can, but keep in mind, more often than not, you're going to be just going from one adjacent level. So architect your system around that. So, kind of getting back, I really think when people talk about how ISA 95 still doesn't apply, I just think there's some misunderstanding. We're taking Purdue, we're taking a security model, we're taking ISA 95, and we're sort of putting it all into one big architecture, and it's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, and the UNS Data Hub, that's bringing out a bit of a different architecture, but like you said, it's still, a lot of the underlying principles of 95 and that still apply.
Yeah. So, really where we're getting with the UNS, it's brilliant because it's taking an event-driven architecture, but it's applying it more on that manufacturing. So, it used to be, and I don't want to pick on OPC, but it's only because that's the technology that's there, but I'm going to have an OPC server. The server is going to instantiate connectivity to the device itself. So now you run the risk of, do I have to open ports in order to connect to some of this information? And so there's always been some inherent security risk. And whenever you're opening a port southbound, meaning I'm going from a point that's less secure to a point that's more secure. That's what I mean by southbound. And the other one is that there's a pull response nature of OPC that I'm constantly asking. It's like the family vacation. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? There's no new information. We're spending a lot of ones and zeros, and we're putting a load on a network infrastructure that there's really no new information. versus when we do like a pub sub, that's when there's new information that the client is just going to publish or present that information to the other systems. So, that's one of the changes there. That's, one of the patterns that you find emerging in these event-driven architectures. And that's where this UNS really took root of, we first want to start off with some of the rules around that. And then, of course, within that architecture, we're going to normalize, contextualize it. Normalizing meaning we're going to look at it in the same slice of time, if you will. What's the current state of the business at any one point? And then, of course, there's also the contextualization. There's going to be information from different systems that are going to provide context. So it's not just a number. We're going to add a unit. And it's not just a unit of measure. It's on what equipment and what product am I running? And, who is the customer? And, what is this order for? And, all the different things that are relevant to that. So that's really what we're doing with that UNS, is providing a common data model for it. But, interestingly enough, coming full circle, I use batch ML, B2M ML for payloads there for a lot of the events. So when there's an event that occurs, so we get into our business logic, if I need to transact something with another system, guess what? I'm applying a standard because I have the ability to, if something should change in the future, no problem. I add to whatever it is that I've already done.
And I mean, UNS, popularized, developed by, Walker Reynolds, the Industry 4 crew over there. Are we seeing some other architectures being developed by, other agencies, or even some sort of, let's say, governmental or quasi-governmental out there?
Yeah, I don't know about governmental per se. I mean, I can't speak to, where all exists, but what I can tell you is that there are a lot of adopters of UNS. Many manufacturers have gone through. I mean, really right now, if you were to say, I'm going to do a UNS, it's going to get funded because there's enough adoption and acceptance of whatever it is that we're doing in order to. So certainly you're going to see more and more of that. The best part of the UNS is that there's not a standard. The worst part of the UNS is there's not a standard. So you are starting to see some movement around how do we commonize, or how can we start developing some common objects? So, when you ask about these government entities, there's a company that's called CESNI that, they have some funding to help try to do some of these things. They're developing these smart manufacturing profiles. And I think you'll see a lot more involvement. And it's, the idea is that they don't want to create what those look like. They want to work with industry partners to start creating some of those. So I think as far as, we're really just sort of that UNS 1.0, if you will. And we're starting to run into, say, what can some of the pitfalls be, or what are some of the things we want to try to overcome and work out. And certainly I would say, having these common data models is definitely going to be one of those. But yeah, you're seeing a lot of integrators that are moving toward utilizing a UNS type approach to integrating the data systems together.
Yeah, and I think we see you can kind of knock on some government entities about being sticklers in that, but I think behind the scenes, and I've seen this with a lot of them, where they're willing to bend a little bit, and if they see your industry has something better out there, they're more than willing to adopt it. I think one of the most high profile cases lately was Tesla with the chargers. Everybody thought the CHAdeMO chargers were going to be the global standard moving forward, and Tesla came out and actually beat them out. Now it's looks like the Tesla supercharger standard is going to go.
I'm old enough to remember the old beta VHS debates, and I was more camp beta. I mean, honestly, we didn't have a VCR, so I didn't really have a dog in the fight. But my understanding is going into being a technologist, and at the time, even back then, I ran the film projector in grade school. I know that's going to come as a big surprise. That was that little weenie, even as a kid, but. Beta, and some will argue, it was actually a better format, but you had more market gravity, coalescing around the VHS format, and that became the standard. But early back, if you remember, the old Blockbusters, the video rental stores, they actually would have to carry both beta and VHS copies of the same movie, and they ended up putting more VHS, renting more VHS, and eventually the beta went away. So you're seeing the same type of thing, but kind of goes back to the standard, so things fit, because there's an XKCD cartoon about current state is there are 14 competing standards. That's the first panel. Next one is let's create one to rule them all. Future state, there are now 15 competing standards out there.
Yeah,
so that's what I'm trying to avoid.
I use that one all the time. If anybody watching this hasn't gone on to literally xkcd.com, one of the greatest comics you'll ever see. Yeah, I didn't get burned on the VHS beta. I do have an old HD DVD player.
No, yeah.
So,
well, then they had these, these laser discs as well. I mean, for a while it was like, the size of an LP, a long playing record. But it was a laser disc. Now, those existed for a while, and boy, if you have those, man, they had a great image to them. But
honestly, I think they'd be really nice. You frame them up, you put them on the wall. They at least look nice. A beta tape or an HDVD just doesn't have the same gravitas.
No. Agreed. Yeah, those laser discs are something to behold.
Yeah. One thing I did want to ask you as well, because I know you've done a lot of work on the standard side of things, is whenever we're trying to get infrastructure into an organization, especially brownfield, because there's a lot of stuff that has to be redone. You dig up the old foundation, put in a new one. Nobody likes to do that. How do you convince the business side that, hey, it's worth going through this effort to, do this foundational work? It's, it can be zero ROI. Like, anybody asks, hey, what's the ROI on this? There really isn't any, but how do you convince someone that we're doing this?
Yeah. So, when I love ROI, only because if somebody gives you an ROI, they're probably making it up, because I certainly know, full disclosure, I'm probably making it up too. Why? Because we just need to get funding for it. And, the thing to keep in mind with ROI is return on investment. There's a lot of ways to calculate ROI. More what I'm interested in is that net present value of, with this investment, what is that going to look like in today's dollars? Reason being, ROI doesn't have a time limit. I may double my money, so I have a 200% ROI. It's going to take me 100 years to get there. That's sometimes with, the number of the ROI that we'd always speak to that. So NPV is good. And that it also gives us a hurdle rate in terms of, what's our internal return rate that we need in order to make an investment. Because if I'm going to dump all this money in and I could get better just, putting in a deposit account at a bank, why not just put in a deposit account at a bank? I want to leverage that and get it back. Thing about digital transformation and putting in these new technologies is this is a market shift in manufacturing. So there's a book by Clayton Christensen. It's called Innovator's Dilemma. And it talks about, interestingly enough, the hard drive manufacturing industry. And as you went from one form factor to the next form factor. So, you think these 8-inch hard drives, if I have the size right, to the 3.5-inch hard drives, to the 2.5-inch hard drives to, and I can't remember if memory is in there. But the idea is that if you were the incumbent at one of those, the 8-inch hard drive space, you spent more time and energy around maintaining your market share than you did investing in the new. Same type of thing happens when we do these, and with these big industrial revolutions. So we always talk about industry 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, that type of thing. When those types of things occur, you see a market shift in who the incumbent is for a lot of the technology that's out there. And in what we saw here in around Industry 3.0 is those companies that evolved, they stayed in business and they were few and far between. And the ones who didn't, they're gone. And even when I'm talking to large companies, I'll say, oh, we're a big company. That's not going to happen to us. Until I remind them, said, yeah, when I was a kid, we got in our Pontiac. We drove to Kmart. We got our GE light bulbs. We got our Kodak film that we processed on a trip that we took flying TWA on a McDonnell Douglas aircraft. So you're right. You could be too big, but keep in mind, you have some very large companies that are no longer there. So for me, this is just an investment in the future. What you'll find when you do that is that the amount of information that it unlocks and the amount of innovation that occurs as a result of having the availability of all the data that is surrounding your plant. There's a lot of things you can do and a lot of changes that you can make once you start unlocking all of these particular systems. So yeah, going into brownfield, there's always going to be wow, that sounds like a lot of money. Well, there's really kind of not an option here. You really need to do this or you're going to get acquired or go out of business. It's just a reality. And I realize that can be skies falling, but you can see that happening progressive anytime there's been these market changes.
Yeah. I mean, the whole, like you said, the sky is falling thing. Yeah. I find it hard sometimes to convince people. And I think, a lot of these people in the upper layers of business have heard the sky is falling over and over and over again, become desensitized to it. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there's so many big companies out there that made the wrong decision. You talked about Blockbuster earlier. Great example. I've got, up in Canada here, we always look at BlackBerry, which, the biggest phone manufacturer in the world up until a certain point.
Yeah, same thing with Nokia. I mean, it's just the market shifted, and that's that innovator's dilemma. Do we want to spend time and energy around making that smartphone, or do I just want to continue to evolve what we already got? And it's a business decision at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. And oddly enough, I had both of those phones. Yeah, the old brick and the old BlackBerry too.
Yeah. Well, so when they started doing the was it the Star Trek the ones with Zach can't remember his last name, and Christopher Pine, I think was his name. So I'm trying to remember which ones they were, but yeah, there's a scene early on where the guy's driving. It's Captain Kirk as a child, and he's driving a car, and the ringtone is that traditional Nokia ringtone. So it's kind of interesting to see it 20 years on now.
Oh, I actually think I know exactly which one you're talking about. Yeah. And it's how you know that somebody's been around technology long enough. They bring that. Still need to bring back snakes though. That was just that was a good game to have.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. It's no, it's I mean, it's good to have, like, it's good to try to convince these people, like, it does take a fair amount, but hopefully we can get them going, because I think that's something big on there. We talked a lot about. Sorry,
I was just gonna say, I mean, in terms of digital transformation, it's an exercise in change management, and change always starts with urgency. There has to be some compelling event that says we need to do something differently. So I can't say I spend a lot of time convincing companies that they need to do something. If they're not aware of how much trouble they're in, I'm not going to convince them. And I think the market, it has a very good way of affecting that change and driving that urgency. My only point is, don't wait till it's too late to, oh crap, we're what are we going to do now? So it does require this thing of, we can't continue on the way we are. Something's got to change. And, when the behavior becomes intolerable enough, that's when you'll see it.
So we've talked a bit about Industry 4 here. I got to ask and see which side of the fence you're on. Industry 5, real thing or not?
I think there will be an Industry 5 that shows up at some point. What it actually is going to be, I don't know. I've seen people talking about Industry 6.0, and my always tongue-in-cheek responsive, can we at least get rid of clipboards off the plant floor first before we start talking about some of those? But I think within Industry 5.0, regardless, right now we're integrating our business systems and our manufacturing systems. That's the fundamental piece, or the element that you'll see within this Industry 4 is just unlocking real-time data. So all these systems that are connecting through that, I think you'll bring on the human element to that. So what does this mean to people? I've also seen that 5.0 is going to be more around this, AI and agentic AI and all the generative AI. There's going to be some element to that as well that can happen there. But really it all starts with, you have to start getting data in real time. You have to start exchanging that information with other systems and start bringing in that context. So, and I love the idea of AI. It's going to solve a lot of problems. We've got to get good source data first. So a lot of time and energy has been spent on cleaning it up. So, to me, is it a real thing? Yes. Are we there yet? No. So, I mean, again, get rid of the clipboard, stop using spreadsheets for your manufacturing planning. There's better tools out there.
Yeah. I think we've still got Industry 4 to get through before we even start talking about that. I think everybody's kind of jumping. I completely agree. I think, you look at the control systems and the signals down low, we're still dealing with 4 to 20s and 3 to 15 PSI in some systems, which.
Yeah. And in many ways, I mean, this is sort of like, a reliability conversation as well. 3 to 15, it's not a bad control process, because, I've been, and I remember that was at a petroleum refinery one time. And they were just talking about, we're getting these super accurate pressure transmitters, but the reality is I can't control any tighter than about 2% a set point anyway, in terms of the overall process. So what's the benefit of me having this like 0.25% accuracy or 10% accuracy type device? Even if I can sense that measurement, I'm really not going to be able to do much that's going to change what's actually happening in the process. Do we need to agree?
Agree to disagree on that one. I think, if you need to have, you got to have as much accuracy as you can. Because I agree. You're going to, you've got a 2% control band on there that you really can't do much about inside of that. I think with AI and that, the better the signal you get out, the better.
Oh, agreed. Yeah, I wasn't saying that there isn't any value to doing that, but just keep in mind that the process might work for that, and It's the whole idea of people say, oh, run to failure. That's a horrible strategy around, reliability. You need to have, predictive and prescriptive. And it's like, that sometimes run to failure is okay because there's no point. It's got to be, what is it, technically feasible and economically viable. It's the same type of thing. And that's what I'm getting at in terms of, there's some transmitters out there that are fairly pricey, and man, they do some amazing things, but does it make sense for the application that you're there? And that's kind of really what I meant by that.
Yeah. One size does not fit all. I think that's one thing to go for. Anytime we're looking at standards, standards are great, but I think you need to have good look at the organization.
Sure. Yeah. So thanks for pushing back just so I could provide some clarity on what the comment was. Because the last thing I wanted to take away, I'm like, this guy's only 2% That's not what I was getting at. Thank you.
That's okay. I'll forgive you on that one. It's I'm used to dealing with the instrumentation controls, so that's where I have strong opinions. Let's put it that way.
It's all good. It's important to have that.
But just to kind of wrap it up here, because I think we're getting close here. So I think good conversation, but want to kind of throw over to you. If you're a company kind of looking at making that leap, making the changes, what advice do you have for them? How do you make that first step? How do you set yourself up for success?
Yeah, and they'll say that the first journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step, and that's how you'll start finding more of system integrators, and we start doing more agile approach to projects. It always starts with let's do something that will unlock data. It's that small step because you want to build the early wins when you are going through these changes. Is that there's going to be a lot of hesitation, there's change, there's a lot of angst around whatever it is that we're doing. So if you really want to be successful, whether it's I want to get rid of defects in my process from a reliability standpoint, or I want to start getting more data, start with something small that it's nice, it's compact, very clear deliverables and outcomes to it, and just start with that and see what does this mean for the organization. It's been my experience that once you take that first step, once you do those first initial projects, that once this information is available, that you're going to start seeing the information is going to be created exponentially, and there's going to be more and more demand for particular projects. So, for instance, there was a company, they presented out at an event where I was, and when they first got going, every plant was, we're not putting that here, but they had an early adopter that said, yes, we're willing to do it. And there's some requirements around that. Now they're about 2 years behind backlog of how soon they can go in and start doing some of these changes. And it's one of those, you're always going to have the early adopters to it. But, unfortunately, those plants that were the laggards, they're because this company, they do rank their plants in terms of, the KPIs that they want. And those plants that got after it earlier on are, they're seeing it a better light. They're just they're higher, more throughput, and they're doing it for less.
Adding people into the process and technology triangle. Yeah, no, that's for sure. Absolutely. DTMAs, great way of getting this kicked off, figure out what the roadmap look like.
Absolutely. Yeah. A lot of the conversations do start around that. If you're not even ready to do it, sometimes it's just some basic consulting around, here's what it is that we're trying to do and gain an understanding of what's there. Because, again, what we're finding is that, it's all education. There's a lot of things out there. How do I know what's real? And then, make sure we can find those things that are going to work. So it's going back to one of my initial comments of find what works and leave the rest. DTMAs are a great way to start.
And shameless plug, do you know any good companies that can provide a DTMA, especially in the Midwest?
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm kind of partial to this company called G5 Consulting, but there's a lot of great ones out there, and I do get to work with it. I'm going to give a shout out to Kevin Jones over at Activox. That's a great organization as well.
Yeah.
So they are out of Pittsburgh. They are unashamedly Steelers fans, but where I grew up, I was okay. Steelers, that was okay.
Okay, so nobody's perfect, but
I know. Well, we chalk it up sometimes to a character defect. What are you going to do?
Very well. Hey, listen, David, great having you on the show today. Really appreciate your time here, and I hope everybody enjoyed this, and we'll chat with you soon.
See you soon.